INISEG, the International Institute for Global Security Studies, has created the INISEG CAST section with the purpose of informing, analyzing, conversing, and discussing in a natural and uncensored way each and every one of the political and social events that happen in society. We are not journalists, but we still believe that we have the power to speak up and educate our audience. Why not deliver a different point of view? No violence, no bad words, no bad intentions. Just be us. We are INISEG CAST, connecting thoughts. Welcome to all our audience to INISEG CAST, the only place that we can talk in spontaneous thoughts, and of course taking very important future about all the currently situation around the world, especially about strategy, military and crisis situation that we are facing. And today we have a really important guest. For me, it's a pleasure to introduce Francois Vreÿ, because he's emeritus professor in the Stellenbosch University. He currently serves as the research coordinator of the Security Institute for Governance and Leadership in Africa, SIGLA, of Stellenbosch University. SIGLA is set up to undertake research and partnership programs with international actors on leadership in Africa. So for us, it's a really honor to have this professional with us today in INISEG CAST.
Today we'll have a very special edition of INISEG CAST because Cabo Delgado is the main topic here in the European Union, here in Portugal. Portugal has a very important ties with Mozambique, and there's a lot of discussion about whether or not Portugal should intervene or must intervene, and under what conditions. And even in Spain is now shifting to Africa, to consider Africa a priority. And Portugal is exercising the presidency of the European Union. So there's a lot of talk about a potential intervention and how to do it in Cabo Delgado, because we do know the severity of the situation on the ground. And so there's a lot of interest as well. So we are seeing counter-information style regarding Cabo Delgado, and it's very important to listen to someone who is impartial and who knows about the subject, really knows about the subject. So we are here today, especially to listen to Francois, to Professor Francois, and to learn.
Professor, according to 2020 data for some NGO, the violence has caused more than 1,100 deaths, okay, and on which 700 were civilians. According to the authorities, it had also caused the displacement of at least 150,000 people. Is there a connection between the insurgency in Cabo Delgado and drug cartels and international crime networks?
Yes, look, the connection is a matter of exactly how do you untangle the connection. We must remember that Cabo Delgado is a rather remote province, a far distance from the capital Maputo in the south. It is also a province where the original counters came from against the government of Frelimo through Renamo. And it is also a province where the setup around extending good governance to that province did not and does not sit very well with the inhabitants of that province. In a certain sense, it's a bit of a neglected province, which obviously creates scope for those who want to exploit the government and governance voids in the province. So There are criminal actors and crime networks, they do exist. I don't think we are talking about the extent of a rising war economy in Cabo Delgado province, but the criminality for Mozambique in general, if one looks at the INACT report, is that it sits at number 14 out of 54 in terms of criminality, and number 2 out of 13 in Southern Africa. Figures that point towards problems around criminal organizations, transnational crime, etc., in Mozambique. So international crime networks are at play in Mozambique. How formal this connection or the connections are to the idea that they are linked to the insurgents, that is something that must be explored. The other part, of course, is that opportunities do exist for drug flows that flow into Cabo Delgado and onwards. And the other part of this is, of course, the outflows of precious gems, as well as logging and animal products that flow out of the province again along various routes. So you have an inflow and an outflow, and if one typifies the flows around drugs, if you typify it around fauna and flora, logging, animal type of products, ivory, horns of rhinoceros, etc., they tie into a larger criminal networks. And the INACT report that puts up the data around this, in fact, the rating that they give Mozambique on the presence of these networks are not good. It's a bit disturbing. So we have to look at this alongside the accusations of official complicity in these networks. Again, the data around that from INACT in particular, unfortunately rates official involvement in these networks rather high. Mozambique is also then the landing point for heroin in particular that's flowing southwards from Afghanistan to an extent via Pakistan, down the Indian Ocean route along the east coast of Africa, down amongst others, but very pertinently to Mozambique. So on the one hand, if one takes the literature, the popular literature that appears around this, and you go back into data tables that tells you something about governance on land, for example, the Mo Ibrahim Index, maritime security governance, the Stable Seas program, and then your INACT research data sets that point towards your organized and transnational organized crime, then the readings of the data seem to merge or seem to support the general literature that there is a problem around this in Mozambique. And unfortunately, Cabo Delgado, with its gas oil hub, its mines regarding precious stones, etc., is part of this. Exactly what the scope is and how it ties in with the insurgency, that is not also clear at the moment. It's type of intimated, it's perhaps more anecdotal, but I believe that eventually the research will make the connection, whether it's a very strong, thick connection or whether the connection is more peripheral. But eventually I think we will also know that side of the story.
And do you think related question with what you just said? Do you think that there are in these drug trafficking routes these very significant numbers, data that you pointed out? There are infiltrated agents or connection to some terrorism funding. from Venezuela, from you mentioned Afghanistan, from Iran. Do you think there's a way Cabo Delgado is not a war economy, but there are external agents infiltrated in Cabo Delgado, and it's not just about the Daesh or the ISIS, the local ISIS or the African Central Command of ISIS, but having these infiltrated agents from these problematic states there in Cabo Delgado.
My answer to that would be the one that I think is most salient and where good data exists and where there is no real ambiguity is the route for heroin that runs south in the Indian Ocean along the east coast of Africa down to Mozambique. Secondly, we shouldn't understand this, that Mozambique is the market, but that Mozambique is a transit point. And if you have a transit point where drugs would move on to other destinations, then obviously you should have a network, let's call them a hub of agents, whether they are Mozambican or whether they are from foreigners in Mozambique, in order to facilitate the flow. If we look towards countries from South America, I want to argue that the flows of cocaine from your South American cartels along the routes that have been identified, those routes do not really run all the way to Mozambique as a type of a transit point. I do know that not so long ago they arrested a very prominent drug cartel kingpin in Mozambique. But two things, it's relevant here. The first one is, according to the data, it was his first entry into Mozambique that they could pick up. He was arrested and the Brazilian authorities picked him up when he was deported and took him back. He was not linked to really setting up, running or sustaining a network in Mozambique. That's the information at the moment. And the other part of this, of course, is that if you look at the data set on transnational organized crime about the type of crimes around drugs and flows that you have for Mozambique, then cocaine is very low on the index. Your crime or the substances like heroin and hashish, or your what we commonly call your other drugs, not your synthetic drugs, is much higher, and that the cocaine link in the index found to be present in or moving through Mozambique is rather small, as opposed to cannabis, as opposed to heroin, for example. So I wouldn't say that there is no South American figures in the drug world present, but the indicators around that the indicators are very low, and I think the most significant one is the one on the Brazilian kingpin that has been removed from Mozambique. But the prominence around this has to do much more with the trade routes running down for heroin that are ancient trade routes, just by the way. It's not newly established. It's ancient trade routes where heroin has now become a byproduct in those trade routes for the sake of convenience, etc. That is what my take is on the whole idea of the involvement of others. If we talk about how does this tie into funding for the local rebels, the rebellion, and it's the postulated link that you've got back to your organizations, Islamic State in the Maghreb, Islamic State with the branch in Central Africa and down now to Mozambique. I would say it's again a question it would not be accurate to say, no, forget it, there's no links, there's no interlink, there's no funding, there's no switching. But one has to untangle this in order to make the connection, because remember, eventually, these matters that we are talking about the links between drugs, between insurgents, between rebels, and between terrorists, these matters, if you want to complete the legal completion around this, these are cases that have to go to court. And therefore, you've got two sides. The one side is the active combating and mitigation of the threat, that it doesn't become a rebellion that runs into the war on terror eventually on Mozambican soil. On the other hand, these matters have to follow a process where eventually, for upholding the rule of law, these matters and individuals should end up in a Mozambican court, or they can end up in the courts in the Seychelles around the Djibouti Code of Conduct, or they could even end up in a court of international justice, depending on what is involved. Please.
Very important also, adding this, the last answer. Do you think that really there is a link between this insurgency in Al-Shabaab and also Hezbollah? Because there is a commentator in Portugal that he's saying, and very persuaded, that the responsible for this insurgency is Central Africa Command of Daesh, Al-Shabaab. What do you think about this opinion?
Right, the first one, if we talk about Hezbollah, we immediately have to talk about Iran in the same sentence. Secondly, I don't think that Hezbollah has a real thick connection. I'm not saying they don't watch what's happening, but they don't have a real connection in my mind to what is happening down in Cabo Delgado. The second one on Al-Shabaab, the literature points and commentators point us to the fact that Al-Shabaab was assumed as a name by those acting in Cabo Delgado, but that there's no formal link as of yet, that they are in fact fully affiliated, funded, and supported by Al-Shabaab in Somalia. We must also remember that the one part is that grassroots or fledgling movements that are upcoming would like to improve their footprint. And here are two matters at play. Higher order entities such as Al-Shabaab, such as Islamic State, could become interested in events along different conduits to events in the north of Mozambique. And the other part is that those that are standing up and emerging in Cabo Delgado who want to improve their profile would like to be associated with established entities like Al-Shabaab, like Islamic State in the Maghreb, or even the Islamic State in the Middle East around Iraq, Syria. However, to have hard facts of that is a little bit more difficult. But I think that we should rather understand that this is something about how the association would bring benefits to those that are emerging, standing up and putting down their footprint down in Cabo Delgado, and the extent, for example, how Islamic State could see this as an opportunity under pressure in the Middle East. We know that they've got a footprint in the Maghreb. We know that there's an emerging footprint more towards Central Africa. And this is a further footprint that could be to their benefit down in Mozambique, in Southern Africa, because we must remember that Southern Africa is probably the regional economic community in Africa that has been most stable and devoid of insurgencies and incursions by movements like Al-Shabaab, like Islamic State, for the moment, up to what we are now seeing in Cabo Delgado. So the footprint is literally going step by step from North Africa to Maghreb, to more to Central Africa, and now we've even got elements of a footprint down in Southern Africa. And I do think that this is one of the reasons why SADC, although very slow, is at the moment fast coming on board, because they don't want this footprint to spread across a region that has been known for its stability and the absence of insurgencies for the past couple of decades, including elements of terrorism.
Do you think, now it's a very hard question, and I will put it in a very diplomatic way. Do you think that there are Mozambican authorities or figures that kind of, turn their head away from the conflict because they see a political interest in there? Do you think, because there's a lot of conspiracy theories as well, that it's the Russians or the Americans that want to promote their interest there in Cabo Delgado, especially regarding the oil resources, in the energy resources, especially to dismantle a very strong European company that is Total from France. Do you think that this is, does this have any sense or makes absolutely no sense?
Right. In the first instance, I want to point out that unfortunately there are indicators in your hard data from your data sets on organized crime, etc., that point the finger to official complicity in the criminality that runs parallel to events in Cabo Delgado. More difficult is to link politicians, officials, to sustaining the armed side of the conflict with its local root causes, and keeping that in order to spoil the rising benefits, the rising growth and establishment of the oil and gas industry, largely the gas industry that sits off the coast of Cabo Delgado. The part around whether they are deliberately trying to influence events to deliberately keep the conflict going in order to spoil the agreements or to offset the agreements around oil and gas with the Mozambican government, I think that process went on for too long to now think that a political conspiracy is going to offset it. My question to you would be, or just something to consider, if you offset or spoil the current process around the oil and gas and coming onto line for the companies that are there now, what is next in line? Who's going to do it? I know the conspiracy on the dark side would be, well, perhaps we could get some other country to come and do it for us. But are you going to start from scratch again after you've been at it for so many years? And then we must also remember that there were no direct attacks on the upcoming infrastructure in Cabo Delgado as far as the rising gas industry is concerned. The closest that it came to really spoiling and upsetting this, I think, evolves from two factors. First, the attacks came too close to the declared security zone of 25 kilometers around the facilities that they are building. And then secondly, the attacks on Palma in particular involved the workers, expatriates, and contract workers, etc., that work for the oil and gas industry. Whether that was a deliberate target, I don't know. But that is the closest to attack and to spoil, because Total had to remove and have a type of evacuation of the people that work and are important workers and contract workers in that industry for the moment. But if that was the objective, I don't know, because there's been no official declaration either by the leadership of the movement in Cabo Delgado, which one could look through two lenses. The one lens is the root causes of dissatisfaction, a leadership that is said to be come from a different angle, and maybe even include external actors. I don't know that they really stood up and said that their objective is to put a stop to the oil and gas development. What we do know is that much of the unrest stood up because of the feeling the oil company, oil and gas industry, the multinationals come in and they invest large sums of money into bringing about the infrastructure in order to bring their products onto line. And secondly, that the Mozambican authorities invested money in order to help them to do it and invest in certain commitments to security, etc. But neither of the two really started to invest at this point in time to bring to the fore some of the root causes and addressing them around matters of infrastructure, roads, bridges, clinics, hospitals, schools, offices, housing, water, to build up that infrastructure in parallel with what is happening. Both government and the multinationals have directed their attention and their efforts and their energy towards the upcoming gas industry. That is a future windfall, of course. It's predicted it could come and mark up to 13% of the gross domestic product or national product of Mozambique in the near future when it comes onto line. But there's no explicit connection. We are doing this in order to offset, upset, or to make sure that the gas industry does not develop in this region. After all, between the precious stones and the gas industry, those two would probably be the economic drivers to the benefit of Cabo Delgado if the authorities in Maputo just get their act together to bring these benefits to a society that probably has reason to be dissatisfied.
That means, in short words, that for these parties, it's not convenient that this conflict ends. Do you think that this will maintain in time, these conflicts, political conflicts, or the Mozambican political power and Tanzania, for example? Do you think it's convenient for them to keep the situation how it is?
I wouldn't argue that it's convenient for them to keep the situation as it is. I would, however, argue that if an insurgency stroke rebellion reaches the stage where we see it at the moment, where it stands in Cabo Delgado, you are not going to push it down and rid that province of those elements very quickly. That's the first point. Secondly, the baseline from which to bring the true benefits around the service delivery governance that the people of Cabo Delgado think, and rightly so think, that they are entitled to from their government, those kinds of infrastructure developments and putting in place those services around security, politics, economics, rule of law, and then your social delivery of goods and services, the baseline is very low at the moment. So you've got a steep hill that the government has to climb in order to begin to satisfy from grassroots up the reasons that many people and entities, the church and leadership in Cabo Delgado feel and is recognized as real root causes why things started going awry in Cabo Delgado. And then the other part with regards to the benefits, that would be a trade-off in terms of those that generally understand that they have to bring Cabo Delgado, the lost province in a certain sense, into the Mozambican national fold, that they should receive the benefits, the windfalls from getting the gas industry running 2023, it's shifting on. I think they moved it to 2025 in some cases. That is the ticket, how they are probably going to lower the curve of bringing the benefits, lower the dissatisfaction, get the society to stand with the authorities of Mozambique and push out the elements such as the radicalization that we are seeing at the moment, and perhaps even pushing out officials that think they are going to benefit. Because remember, what we see at the moment is not to the benefit of Mozambique, and it is not to the benefit of the average citizen in Mozambique. Perhaps it's to benefit a certain element of the elite, but when you start looking at that, the fraction in the pyramid up to the top becomes smaller and smaller and smaller about who benefits. And the art that we are looking at here is to benefit the lower broad base of the pyramid in Mozambique. And that is what the government, that is why the government is in place. That is why you have the responsibility of government to deliver quality public goods to their societies, their people, because the people are entitled to it. It's not they're doing them a favor. It's their responsibility to deliver quality goods to their societies. That's it. That's the bottom line. You can come with all kinds of other arguments. That's the bottom line. You're the government in power, and you are responsible to deliver quality goods to your people.
Do you think, President Filipe Nyusi is up to it? Do you think he can have political conditions to accomplish that? And do you think that, regardless the social and economic situation, do you think that for now, an international coalition or international intervention in a multilateral or by Russians or by United States, we know that the United States offer help to Mozambique, but the US support was turned down by the Mozambique government. What do you think should be the response of the international community?
Right. First of all, I think we must take note that the president of Mozambique was very explicit and has a very hard stance about Mozambique is a sovereign country.
Okay.
Secondly, that he and his party, it appears, is not amenable to accepting any assistance from parties, from agencies, from actors that in any way could detract, erode, or even be symbolic of the Mozambican authorities cannot cope with this, and thus they have to look outside, and that the perception around this is about we in fact give up elements of our sovereignty in order to cope with a problem in Cabo Delgado. And that stance has been a persistent stance. Secondly, I would like to note around that sovereignty is a right, but there's a shift that is in process. Sovereignty is also a responsibility, and that responsibility is to your people. If we talk about foreign aid in terms of the military side, coalitions, etc., yes, at the moment, the Mozambican president, I don't see him as type of shifting on the stance around sovereignty. And the reason why I say this, and this is my personal opinion, that the entity that probably would have had or should have had the most influence to say, how can we help, should have come from the African Union via SADC. Mm-hmm. So in principle, there is a shift in my mind that we will follow the Africa agenda as far as possible. And the Africa agenda would probably follow something along the lines where the African Union would place a request or suggest to SADC to do what it can, that it in fact did last year already, if I'm not mistaken, and that SADC has to follow a diplomatic pathway in line with the African Union in order to engage the authorities of Mozambique. Ultimately, it is for the Mozambican leadership to decide who they will allow in, who they won't allow in. So it's not a question that SADC will arrive at the border one day and tell, okay, here we are. It's a very diplomatic process with some entrapments that can upset everything. And if the argument is around, listen, we need to get boots on the ground as soon as possible, it is probably going to be through the SADC standby arrangement that will have to be reactivated, get it into place around its own standby arrangements in order to react. This does not mean that now you won't have American special forces helping with specialist training. But remember, I think we're talking about 15 people. This does not mean we won't have, for example, assistance from Portuguese specialists that would help with training elements of the Mozambican armed forces. There's a difference between a small training team to do specialist training and an element of a force for intervention that becomes a type of a military footprint on the soil of Mozambique. And therefore, I don't see that we will see much from the United Nations, that we will see anything arriving from the United States, from France, etc. At the moment, the one that is making most progress, and I agree very slowly and it should have moved faster, is the one that runs via the SADC structures with the organ on defense, politics and security. That is the one that can make the recommendation for the SADC decision to say, this is now time to put in place the modalities, the agreements, in order to bring the SADC standby force into the picture in the ways that they agree with the Mozambican authorities. Personally, I don't think we should expect foreign intervention. I know there's the references to your private military contractors, but remember, private military contractors are not states. And for an agreement between a government with a private military contractor does not mean that they have now recognized these contractors as some important entity. I think that why we see the private military contractors in place could be arguments such as, we wanted something on the ground as soon as possible. It is said of certain private contractors, they are very good at stepping in, building the intelligence picture, advising what needs to be done next, and assisting to stop the fast progress of an insurgency as we are seeing in the north of Mozambique. But we also know that the Wagner group that came in got it wrong, and they departed. We know that because where are they? They did not do well, and obviously they also have other interests in Africa, in the Central Africa Republic, in Libya, etc. And but the bottom line around that one didn't work well. We've got DAG, the Dyke Advisory Group.
Yes.
That's making a contribution, but what we must understand from DAG, it's because they could bring the element of a small element of air power built around light, very light armed helicopters into the picture, for which the insurgents did not have an answer. The other part of this, of course, is that one of the elements that I think gave a shock to the involvement of the Wagner group, when they engaged with the insurgents, whether you had the radical Islamic State labeled elements involved or not, they came off second best with casualties that was probably casualties that were not acceptable to their leadership. And obviously the decision was, get out, this is above our fireplace. DAG is not a private military company as I read it. It played other roles that it were very good at, and then it became involved upon request from the Mozambican authorities. And they did play a role because of the capability to be able to bring the element of air power in terms of light firepower. And then, as we saw with the attacks on Palma, the element of doing some evacuation with helicopters that were not really built and structured for evacuation under such difficult conditions. So whether DAG is going to be the sunset of private military contractor involvement or not, I don't know. Probably if the SADC involvement builds rapidly, the need for elements like DAG could be scaled down or contracts not be renewed. But in the absence of other elements that do well, in the absence of the elements of the Mozambican armed forces that are not doing well and now are going through a rapid curve of being trained to cope with what they have to do, what do you use as a stopgap or intermediary type of strategy? Who can arrive quickly and probably put a bit of a plug on this? And that is where your private contractors possibly come in, with the first one not making it and the second one showing a little bit more staying power because of the element of air power that it could bring until the Mozambican armed forces catch up, or whether the Mozambican armed forces become better and are augmented possibly by an element of the SADC standby force that gets deployed. I just don't know how quickly that can happen because they have their own deployment schedules around mobilization, deployment, and later their employment.
But do you think that the PMCs can be a better answer, at least in the short time, than an international or a state, traditional classic state intervention in Mozambique? So you think that the PMCs, in terms of intelligence, in terms of detection of the problems on the ground, can be better? Because it's very interesting that you refer Lionel Dyke, because I was looking at the Portuguese newspapers and some of the new European newspapers in general, and they are referring a new role, progressive, stronger, a role of Lionel Dyke in Cabo Delgado, in Mozambique, and especially in Cabo Delgado. And also
Right.
Wagner from Russia, you mentioned as well, that Russia is using Wagner to interfere in Cabo Delgado.
Okay. We must remember that the role of Wagner from Russia, the Russian entity, they did not just arrive there because they thought it's important to be there. They arrived and played a role via the Mozambican government that probably, let's say, contracted with them via the Russian authorities. DAG is a different kettle of fish, I think, because they are not affiliated to a government like Wagner.
Mm-hmm.
So you can have an agreement between a State Department of Mozambique and the Dyke Group. A third element that I want to point out, you're asking whether your private contractors can replace intervention by states. I want to distinguish between private military contractors that are professional in working, in bringing the military skills and ability to fight into the picture, and your private security contractors that deliver other services, and of which we probably have quite a number in Cabo Delgado, basically concentrated around the security of the upcoming gas hub. These are not the same entities, although you can have an overlap. If you bring in a very professional private military contractor that know what they are doing, and we know there have been success stories around that, like in Nigeria, like in Sierra Leone, for example. They can play a positive role, but I think the history and experience at the moment tells us their staying power gets chipped away by a lot of criticism, and where their contribution eventually it gets overtaken by either your local authorities bringing their own security forces onto line, doing better, becoming more successful, and the role of your private contractors begin to decline, for example, only to training, only to helping with some intelligence, and eventually it fades away, because we must remember it's a contract that you go into. And those contracts have clauses about shutting down, asking you to leave, or you work out your contract and you leave with a good or a bad name. I won't say that we see that private military contractors are overtaking the role that states with your institutionalized military forces are playing, that they are better, that they do better, etc., and that they are replacing them. No. Okay. They are not in that league, but they have a role to play in order to dampen down and to scale down elements of threats and vulnerabilities that tend to get out of line. The question, of course, is whether the Dyke Advisory Group's contract is going to be renewed. But it's up to the Mozambican government, because they don't have to ask anybody's permission to renew the contract with the Dyke Advisory Group. It's up to them to renew or to say thanks for coming, but your contract is over. And typically under conditions where you, for example, they know that they will now get much more support from state entities, whether those entities are collective entities like SADC, or whether it could be, for example, Portugal, that is prepared to step in alongside a country like France to help more and more and more.
To try to think about overall the situation and about this insurgency in Cabo Delgado. For our audience, after you express all your thoughts and your opinion, theories, and all the situation that is currently happening in Cabo Delgado, for our audience, what would be overall side the situation from now on in Cabo Delgado about this conflict, that about drugs, about traffic, cartels, and what means Cabo Delgado for all the region? Because what is the important topic here that our audience wants to understand? Because it's very complicated to try to link with different situation in Iraq, in Afghanistan. So a resume of the situation in Cabo Delgado now and your expectations for the future.
Right, with regards to the criminality networks, etc., that you refer to, that's not going to go away. They are going to stay there. They might be under conditions of improved governance with security, policing, and rule of law being wrapped up. The pressure on them could increase, but they are not going to disappear. That's the first one. The second one is that the radicalization and the elements that apparently now entered the scene in Cabo Delgado, I have my doubts whether they're just going to fade away. That is a threat that you have to address. And you have to address it with multiple means. And one of the means that threat, that's an armed threat by radical elements that showed their willingness to execute attacks, their willingness not to hit and run, but to remain in towns that they take over for a time, and the way in which their ability to fight is increasing, to plan and to fight is increasing, that tells us you are not going to push that military fighting element out of Cabo Delgado by merely increasing the governance and service delivery and pumping money, infrastructure development, etc., into the province. The two-tracked approach that will have to go hand in hand is the one where you will have to either build your own capability to outfight the armed elements, whether they are a fringe element, a foreign element, or an established element by now within the bigger rebellion stroke insurgency in Cabo Delgado. You will have to come with the ability to outfight them. But the military answer is bringing in a military is either by improving your own forces, their ability to do this, and or secondly, to look to partnerships to deal with getting a handle on this by the Mozambican authorities. Who's going to help you to isolate and shrink the armed element and their influence so that you can run your other programs of more of a civilian kind to type of fill up the ungoverned space that gave so much oxygen and room to dissatisfaction and elements of rather turning to armed factions than to the government. And then, of course, in Cabo Delgado, it is important. They have to get that gas industry onto line. If you look at the economy of Mozambique, where does the economy feature in terms of progress, in terms of growth? the difficulty it had a couple of years ago with the whole dilemma stroke scandal about the purchasing of vessels around fishing and patrol vessels. That hurt the Mozambican economy, and it hurt the Mozambican image. And therefore, you need now to have the ability to build upon what went wrong in order to increase your image, to increase your cooperation. If you turn your attention offshore, because remember, Cabo Delgado does not only border to Mozambique in the north, it also borders on the Indian Ocean, and that much of the gas discoveries and the infrastructure to bring it onto line is located offshore. So that is also a serious area of concern that you have to secure offshore, because what you don't want is that your armed elements on land type of strike a major goal by interfering with what is happening offshore. That would be absolutely catastrophic, whether it is by attacking, damaging infrastructure, or attacking and damaging other economic maritime activities around fishing, around shipping, around the coastal community that depends on the ocean's economy for their survival. That you don't want. And the question is, of course, can Mozambique keep all these balls in the air, fighting the military side, having negotiations to bring elements in to sustain them, bringing the image and the governance back onto track into Cabo Delgado, ensuring and safeguarding the emerging gas economy on land, and securing the immediate ocean territory of Cabo Delgado. That's a tall order for a government that is struggling because of so many other matters that don't go well. You know, it's easy to sit and throw stones on them, but just keeping those balls in the air, not dropping one of them, is very important, because the one you drop is going to impact on retracting on any of the others. You have to balance them all in order to make progress. In a typical type of connectivity is that your oil and gas industry online could probably bring the windfalls to put up more into developing the local economy, satisfying the needs of people, and to fund your own armed forces to keep elements of armed insurrection at bay. So the connection between these sectors are very important. And you have to make them work, but they are interconnected.
Yeah, I think that after listening to Professor Francois Vreÿ, I think the conflict is pretty much summed up, and we have a lot of guidelines here to analyze, and to invite again Professor Francois to discuss with us the evolution of the conflict in Cabo Delgado on the ground. I think that there are a lot of things to stress out. I think the first is that Cabo Delgado must be understood in the context of international criminality. The data, as Professor pointed out, we have to work and analyze the data in order to get to know how much of this interconnectivity between what's happening in Cabo Delgado and in international criminality are in an accurate way and analysis. Secondly, the very interesting aspect that I think is understated, has been understating that is the connection between the conflict, the social and the social dimension. There's maybe Cabo Delgado is, and I would put this in not in a mildly way, might be understood as well as the the weakness and the failure of the Mozambican state. If the Mozambique state, the Mozambican government does not intervene, maybe, and taking into account the Professor Vreÿ's analysis, there is the risk that Mozambique fails into a failed state, because what can happen is that we have provinces, several provinces that have their own authority. The state, there is no centralized authority, and that's the escalation to the instability in Mozambique and then in the region. And there is an element that we should look very carefully. Professor has told us that even in South Africa, there is the spectrum of instability started right now, and that is very worried. And another aspect is we have to look there, because there's a lot of information and counter information regarding an international intervention in terms of if the United States, the European Union, or Russia. But Professor has told us that the main topic, our focus should be on the SAD intervention, and never forget that Mozambique is a sovereign state. We must obey and bend to Mozambican sovereignty. But in case of the right, and Professor told us that, and I totally agree that sovereignty is both a right and a duty. And when this duty is not fully observed, the first step forward should be within the African region, the African continent, and SAD must play a very important role. Regarding the question, so in order to finish for now for this first intervention, and we do hope that Professor can join us later in some future occasions again, but I think that's an important question. That is, so having considered all the factors, can Mozambican and Cabo Delgado situation become a major counter-terrorism global threat? So not only from Cabo Delgado, and now it's very, people are analyzing the case as a very located one, but does this case has the potential to become a major international threat?
A major international threat, I think we need to recognize the following. SADC does not want what's happening in Cabo Delgado to spread to the surrounding countries. You must remember, Cabo Delgado, Mozambique, borders on South Africa, Swaziland, Zimbabwe. It goes, and you've got countries like Mozambique, you've got Tanzania, you've got the countries like Malawi that are almost directly bordering Mozambique. And then you've got that Zimbabwe, Malawi, Zambia, etc., and Tanzania is very close to Cabo Delgado, and they are also SADC members. Mm-hmm. So SADC does not want this to have any overspill into the rest of the region. Secondly, in terms of internationalization, one strand of literature that looks at this sees it as another footprint on the global war on terror, and thus an American interest. Mm. So the question is, how solid or tenuous is the link as another hub on the global war of terror? A third way of looking at it is the argument that Islamic State is under pressure and building a larger and larger footprint in African regions and countries in order to build its image that it is not irrelevant. and that Mozambique is something where they can say, well, we've got a footprint in the north, we've got it in the Sahel, we've got it in Central, and now we've got it in Mozambique. Yes, take note of it. Another matter of internationalization is, for me, it's the question of whether this conflict remains on land or whether it spills over into the ocean. If it spills into the ocean, it probably is going to have an immediate international impact if shipping and other industries, maritime industries, become threatened, become disrupted. And remember, here we don't have to talk about physical attacks. We only have to talk about perceptions. No shipping, no longer going through the Mozambique Channel. Reroute. Take the longer route or avoid it, go through the Suez Canal. So these are the types of international spillovers that we're looking at. And then the other question, of course, that becomes important is how would other movements, type of radical movements, how would they look at this as a type of solidarity, or perhaps a link up, or perhaps cooperation with elements in Mozambique to be understood as the linkages run back across the African footprints, and as some of the literature notes, the links run up through East Africa, right up back to their higher echelon leadership in Syria, Iraq. So these are elements of internationalization that can be linked back over down to Mozambique. And of course, the art around this is combat, minimize, and make sure you force it out while it's still small. Therefore, do it now and everybody get your house in order. Mozambique authorities, SADC, as well as the African Union. You don't want another radicalization, Islamic State style footprint on African soil.
About migrations, right? Do you think that, because we have in the North Africa a problem of migrations to Europe, and so do you think that this escalation in Mozambique can double down the situation of the problem of migration and therefore create a problem of national security for Europe?
I'm not so sure about that one. Mozambique is really, really far down the line. It could, and it already did, cause a migration type of a flashpoint in Mozambique, for example, towards Tanzania, and we must remember other countries are close by, and we see people that have moved out from the hotspots gathering in refugee centers in Cabo Delgado. I think that the migration matter is less something this could increase and push towards Europe, but what we should not forget is that it could have migration implications for Mozambique, people leaving Cabo Delgado to settle in adjacent provinces where they become refugees, internal displacement, or they move across into countries adjoining, easiest being Tanzania, Zimbabwe perhaps, and then we don't even have to talk much about the number of Mozambicans that reside in South Africa in any case and are not legally in the country. In South Africa, which is already problematic, and if migrants move from Cabo Delgado, they will probably, if they can have a preference, they'll move to South Africa.
Okay.
Unfortunately, Cabo Delgado is something like 1,700 kilometers plus from the South African borders, even further. The other countries are much closer, so it will have a migratory impact, but probably in the region. And SADC doesn't want that, and South Africa doesn't want a bigger push of migrants across its borders from Mozambique or through Zimbabwe.
Okay, Professor, thank you very, very much for to have you here. It's a pleasure, really, and share all your opinion. And it was like a class. I don't know, if you felt.
I have here like
Yeah,
7 pages.
I wrote some phrases very, very clever, so I can also look more into this conflict. Thank you, Professor.
Okay.
It was an honor, really, to meet you, and I hope this can be a second chance to talk with you and analyze the situation in another opportunity.
Buenos días, soy el profesor David de Cachal, director del área de Seguridad y Defensa de INISEG. Hoy hemos entrevistado en INISEG CAST a Francois Vreÿ, profesor asociado de Estrategia Militar del Departamento de Estrategia Militar de la Facultad de Ciencias Militares de la Universidad de Stellenbosch, en Sudáfrica. El profesor Joao Lemos y la directora de comunicación Rosana Benda le han realizado una serie de preguntas que en mi cápsula de análisis intentaremos contextualizar. En una de esas preguntas que iremos analizando a lo largo de esta cápsula de análisis de la entrevista, el profesor Joao Lemos le preguntó si existía algún tipo de conexión entre la insurgencia en Cabo Delgado y los cárteles de la droga y las redes criminales internacionales en la zona de Mozambique. Podríamos pensar y analizar que los casi 2,5 millones de habitantes de la provincia mozambiqueña de Cabo Delgado, mayoritariamente musulmana, que se encuentra a unos 2.600 kilómetros al norte de Maputo, la capital del país, no salen de su aturdimiento. Pocos de ellos pueden comprender las razones de por qué desde el año 2017 sus vidas han cambiado de modo irreversible, aunque todos sufren las consecuencias de que ese extremismo wahabita los haya puesto en la mira de sus objetivos. Hay que recordar que Cabo Delgado es una provincia es una de las más, digamos, más septentrionales de la República de Mozambique, haciendo frontera con Tanzania a través del río Rovuma. La provincia de mayoría musulmana y rica en gas natural ha sido históricamente una de las provincias más olvidadas de Mozambique, llegando a ser conocida en portugués como Cabo Enquecido, es literalmente Cabo Olvidado. Está distante unos 1.700 kilómetros de la capital, de Maputo, escenario de combates durante la Guerra de Independencia del país y también de la Guerra Civil que le sucedió el 5 de octubre del 2017, que comenzó a atraer las miradas no solo del resto del país, sino también del mundo entero, cuando un ataque armado sacudió la zona. Desde entonces, el islamismo radical ha ido ganando posiciones hasta convertirse en una fuerza potente, por lo que el gobierno mozambiqueño se ha visto obligado a pedir ayuda internacional para combatirlos. La insurgencia islamista en el norte de Mozambique es un conflicto en curso en la provincia de Cabo Delgado, que enfrenta a grupos islamistas que intentan establecer un Estado islámico en la región y las fuerzas de seguridad de Mozambique. Los civiles han sido los principales objetivos de los ataques de los grupos islamistas. La principal facción insurgente es Ansar al-Summa, una facción extremista nativa con tenues conexiones internacionales. Hay que recordar que desde mediados del 2018 el Estado Islámico de Irak y el Levante, el IL, supuestamente también han manifestado estar activo en el norte de Mozambique y reivindicó su primer ataque contra las fuerzas de seguridad de Mozambique en junio de 2019. Por otro lado, grupos de delincuentes han aprovechado también de la rebelión para organizar también redadas. En enero del 2019, recordemos que la empresa Total, la empresa francesa, anunció la evacuación de su personal a causa de la COVID y también del yihadismo. Ansar al-Sunna, también conocido por su nombre original Anlu Sunna Wayamo, traducido como adeptos a la tradición profética, fue inicialmente un movimiento religioso en los distritos del norte de Cabo Delgado que apareció por primera vez alrededor de 2015. Fue formado por seguidores del clérigo radical keniano Abu Rogo, asesinado en 2012. Posteriormente, algunos miembros de su movimiento se establecieron en Kidby, Tanzania, antes de trasladarse a Mozambique en 2015. Ansar al-Sunna afirma que el Islam, tal como se practica en Mozambique, se ha corrompido y ya no sigue las enseñanzas de Mahoma. En consecuencia, los miembros del movimiento entraron en mezquitas tradicionales con armas para amenazar a otros para que siguieran sus propias creencias radicales. El movimiento también es anticristiano y antioccidental y ha tratado de evitar que la gente acuda a hospitales o escuelas que considera seculares y antiislámicas. Este comportamiento alejó a gran parte de la población local en lugar de convertirlos en Alú, Sunna, wa Janó, por lo que los miembros del movimiento se separaron y crearon sus propios lugares de culto. Con el tiempo, el grupo se volvió cada vez más violento, pidió que se le implementara la Sharia en el país, ya que no reconocía al gobierno de Mozambique, y comenzó a formar campamentos ocultos en el distrito de Macomia, el distrito de Mocimboa, da Paria y el distrito de Montepuez. Allí los militares de Ansar al-Sunna fueron entrenados por expolicías y exguardias fronterizos que habían sido despedidos y guardaban rencor contra el gobierno. El movimiento también se puso en contacto con otros militares islamistas en África Oriental y, según los informes, contrató adiestradores de Al-Shabaab de Somalia, Tanzania y Kenia. Sin embargo, estos adiestradores de Al-Shabaab actuaron como mercenarios y ayudaron a Ansar al-Sunna no por las conexiones reales entre Al-Shabaab y Ansar al-Sunna, sino por la paga que recibían de este último. Algunos de los militares de Ansar al-Sunna también han viajado al extranjero para recibir entrenamiento directo de otros grupos militantes. Los militantes no están unificados, sino divididos en diferentes células que no parecen coordinar sus acciones. Recordemos que en agosto del 2018 la policía de Mozambique había identificado a 6 hombres como líderes de los militantes en Cabo Delgado: Abdul Faisal, Abdul Vreÿ, Abdul Remane, Ib Omar, llamado Salimo, y Nuno Remane. Ansar al-Sunna se financia mediante el comercio de heroína, contrabando y marfil. Una fuerte censura impuesta por las autoridades provinciales dificulta también la evaluación de la situación real de la crisis en la provincia norteña, epicentro, evidentemente, de las acciones terroristas. La provincia de Cabo Delgado es extremadamente rica, además de las explotaciones hidrocarburíferas. Recientemente puestas en marcha cuenta con explotaciones de rubíes, madera y oro, lo que, como es frecuente en muchas regiones del mundo, no redunda en el beneficio de sus pobladores, que en muchos casos, para sobrevivir, deben dedicarse al comercio ilegal de marfil y drogas, particularmente en el caso de marfil, ¿no? En el caso de heroína, que pasa por Cabo Delgado y en una de las mayores exportaciones de Mozambique. A ellos también se suma el contrabando de piedras preciosas, la caza y el tráfico ilegal de animales silvestres, lo que ha dado lugar a la creación de importantes redes criminales y cárteles, casi siempre manejados por las élites políticas. Mozambique ha vivido una larga guerra civil entre el 76 y el 92, que dejó 1.300.000 muertos, casi 2 millones de refugiados fuera del país y 500.000 desplazados internos. Una marca de sangre mucho más fácil de revivir que de borrar. Otra de las preguntas que se llevaron a cabo durante la entrevista era si realmente en Portugal hay un comentarista en televisión que insiste en que el responsable de la insurgencia en el comando centroafricano del Daesh, Al-Shabaab, y que no hay conexión alguna con los chiíes de Hezbollah. Se estaba de acuerdo en esos, conexiones que pudiera haber entre los iraníes de Hezbollah, entre los chiitas de Hezbollah y los suníes del Daesh, del Estado Islámico. Hay que recordar que Irán se alía con Al-Shabaab en Somalia para la distribución de armas a los rebeldes hutíes. Hay que recordar que también hay fuentes del gobierno del país africano que relacionan al régimen de los ayatolás con la organización terrorista somalí, protagonista de ataques al ejército de Estados Unidos. La República Islámica de Irán ha entablado lazos con el grupo yihadista Al-Shabaab en Somalia para atacar a destacamentos de Estados Unidos y otras fuerzas internacionales en el país africano y también en la región para, destinar armas a los rebeldes hutíes en Yemen, según también informaciones vertidas en diversos artículos de política internacional que citan al gobierno somalí y a funcionarios de seguridad. Según lo difundido, de lo cual se hizo eco el medio de Arabilla, el país persa tiene una red desplegada en Somalia orientada a ofrecer apoyo a organizaciones extremistas violentas para hacer frente a la influencia de Estados Unidos y a los estados del Golfo rivales, como el caso de Arabia Saudí o de Emiratos Árabes. Irán también ha establecido su red de poder en Somalia, utilizando incentivos financieros. Utiliza también el país del continente africano para canalizar armas a la milicia hutí presente en Yemen y para transportar armas a otros países en África como Kenia, Tanzania, Sudán del Sur, Mozambique y la República Centroafricana, según los datos ofrecidos por el periódico Al Arabilla, desprendidos de las informaciones derivadas. Irán sigue utilizando la misma táctica de intromisión en los asuntos internos de otras naciones. Se vale de la actuación de sus fuerzas, las fuerzas Quds, División Internacional de la Guardia Revolucionaria Islámica, cuerpo de élite del ejército iraní, para, digamos, operar en otros territorios, principalmente a través de alianzas con grupos de la misma confesión chií presentes en estos países. El ejemplo más claro de estos son los casos de Hezbollah en el Líbano, de Hamas en Palestina, la milicia de origen afgano Liwa Fatimiyun en Siria o las fuerzas de movilización popular en Irak. O también los propios combatientes hutíes en el marco de la guerra civil del país yemaní en el ámbito de Oriente Medio. En esta lista, las fuerzas de Quds han establecido lazos con grupos extremistas y redes criminales, según las fuentes gubernamentales somalíes. Esta rama internacional de la Guardia Revolucionaria iraní utiliza estos nexos para, digamos, pasar de contrabando petrolero iraní a Somalia y luego venderlo a precios baratos en África para evitar las sanciones de Estados Unidos, según datos ofrecidos por la policía somalí y también funcionarios del Ministerio de Finanzas que publicó dicho periódico Al Arabiya. Parte de estos beneficios se destinan a apoyar a aliados en Yemen y Somalia. Sobre Irán sigue pesando las sanciones económicas impuestas por Estados Unidos, a raíz también de la salida norteamericana en 2018. De ese pacto nuclear sellado con el Estado iraní en 2015 debido a los incumplimientos persas de esos términos de ese pacto. Precisamente los hutíes han venido siendo señalados por varios ataques a infraestructuras petrolíferas y aeroportuarias en el Reino Saudí. Irán habría brindado al Shabab apoyo financiero y material y puede haber pagado recompensas a militantes para atacar a las fuerzas norteamericanas en Somalia y en la región. El dinero y las armas iraníes podrían haber sido utilizados en los ataques de la formación terrorista somalí en 2019 y en 2020 contra bases militares norteamericanas en territorio africano, así como también contra el convoy militar de la Unión Europea en Mogadiscio. Las fuerzas de seguridad participantes en operativos contra Al-Shabaab en el centro-sur de Somalia descubrieron armas así como equipamiento para fabricar bombas y productos químicos de Irán, según lo relatado. Los funcionarios han afirmado que los ataques de Al-Shabaab desde el 2017 se han vuelto más letales y atribuyen, las mayores capacidades del grupo a las armas de origen extranjero, la mayoría provenientes de Irán y del Yemen. También hay que recordar que Al-Shabaab no reconoció que la ofensiva estuviese relacionada con la muerte de Soleimani, pero la conciencia podría indicar que los dos sucesos podrían tener bastante relación. Otra de las preguntas que se le llevaron a cabo al profesor Francois es si cree que hay, agentes infiltrados de Venezuela, Colombia o Cuba para proteger a los cárteles narcotraficantes en Cabo Delgado, para proteger esas rutas del tráfico y del comercio de la droga, de los cárteles y del crimen organizado a nivel internacional. Vamos a ver, una vez combatido ese enemigo armado, hay que combatir al enemigo que no tiene armas. Esa frase de Mao Zedong colocaba de forma destacada en la entrada de una librería de Maputo, ilustra la determinación del régimen mozambiqueño por eliminar radicalmente todo aquello que se oponga al despegue económico, incrementando la vigilancia. La noción del sabotaje y el término de reeducación política adquieren en Mozambique un sentido aleccionador, que en una sociedad desarrollada tendría seguramente acentos de despotismo, del mismo modo que parecería retrógrada la insistencia en revalorizar, en términos culturales, un pasado histórico a través de una crítica sistemática de la civilización occidental y sus nefastos efectos sobre el hombre africano. La promoción de tales campañas no tiene nada que ver con un universo concentratorio de Gulag, como tampoco se ajustan a la realidad los informes aparecidos en la prensa sudafricana y británica a propósito de la presencia de miles de soldados cubanos, chinos y tanzanios en Mozambique, a la existencia de una base militar soviética en la isla de Baxotufo y de la imposibilidad de salir de Maputo sin verse detenido en las barricadas que el ejército tendría instaladas en la carretera. Lo cierto es que ni en Maputo, en Beira, en Quelimane y en otros puntos visitados existe la menor traza de tropas cubanas o chinas. Incluso es rarísimo ver a los propios soldados mozambiqueños en el centro de las ciudades. La mayor parte de las Fuerzas Armadas se encuentra concentrada en la zona fronteriza con Rodesia, que tiene una amplitud, superior a los 1000 kilómetros. El destacamento militar femenino, la única unidad militar observada en los 80 kilómetros que van de Maputo a la granja estatal de Moamba, evoluciona y realiza maniobras tras maniobras sobre el terreno condenante, pero tampoco aquí hay, indicio de instructores extranjeros que, por otro lado, hubiera resultado en harto extremo curioso, ya que todos los elementos del referido destacamento son muchachas. En todo el país es visible, sin embargo, la presencia de técnicos cubanos, chinos y coreanos del norte. Los hoteles de Maputo están llenos de ellos y su actividad concierne a varios proyectos en curso de realización. Los coreanos construyen una fábrica de tapices y de lápices y otra de fósforos. Los chinos están presentes en numerosos planes agrícolas y los cubanos han organizado el servicio de radiotaxis de Maputo y están tratando de poner en marcha la importante fábrica de azúcar de Marromeu, perteneciente a la firma británica Sugar States, que jamás llegó a entrar en funcionamiento desde su construcción hace ya más de 2 años. Sí, también existen instructores militares cubanos o chinos en las bases del movimiento nacionalista de Zimbabue, en ZANU, es algo que no puede comprobarse, aunque no sería de extrañar que así fuera. Como tampoco puede descartarse el que el ejército mozambiqueño siga recibiendo una asistencia en personal especializado chino, soviético o coreano. Las porosas fronteras de Mozambique, una extensa costa y un gobierno fragmentado y corrupto han convertido al país en un punto de transbordo cada vez más popular para los traficantes internacionales de droga. Normalmente la cocaína es ingresada en Mozambique a través de mulas de droga que viajan en avión desde Colombia y Brasil, aunque algunas también llegan por mar. Los patrones de captura y de incautaciones en el aeropuerto de la capital, Maputo, pues nos indicarían que la mayoría de estas mulas son ciudadanos sudafricanos, mozambiqueños, nigerianos o también de Tanzania. Gran parte de la cocaína es transportada posteriormente hasta Sudáfrica, el mayor mercado de consumo regional, o también es llevada a Europa y Asia Oriental. La verdad y la venta local de esta cocaína a turistas y ciudadanos de Mozambique también se vuelve cada vez más un subproducto de comercio de droga. Algunos creen que los esfuerzos de las autoridades para contrarrestar las actividades de tráfico de droga se ven comprometidas por la corrupción por parte de los funcionarios de seguridad y del gobierno, y por la falta, evidentemente, de recursos. Las otras drogas que más transitan por Mozambique son la heroína, el mandrax, un sedante y la marihuana, las cuales pues, son enviadas principalmente desde el sur de Asia y en los últimos años África se ha convertido en un punto de transbordo popular para los traficantes de cocaína. En Latinoamérica, quienes se aprovechan de los corruptos e ineficaces controles de seguridad y de la proximidad del continente para el cada vez más importante mercado europeo. La ubicación de Mozambique en la costa oriental de África hace que sea una opción menos obvia como punto de tránsito para la cocaína que llega de las Américas, en particular para las drogas transportadas por medio de rutas marítimas. Otra de las preguntas que se efectuaron al profesor Francois Vreÿ era si creía que el actual poder político mozambiqueño y de Tanzania estarían interesados en mantener ese conflicto y qué opinaba sobre la posibilidad, ¿no?, de que la empresa francesa Total pudiera socavar sus objetivos de ampliar sus comercios en Mozambique con el gas, evidentemente tras los continuos atentados yihadistas en la zona. Hay que recordar que en Mozambique el enfrentamiento entre los Frelimo y Renamo ha sido casi una constante desde su independencia en Portugal de 1975. La guerra civil, un tablero más de la Guerra Fría, que duró del 77 al 92, causó cientos de miles de muertos y desplazados, y el conflicto resurgió en 2013 al 2016 y fue en agosto del 2019 cuando se firmó el último acuerdo de paz, el tercer, y se esperaba que definitivo, intento de acabar con un conflicto propio de otras épocas. El Frelimo, que gobierna en Mozambique desde la independencia y que arrasó en las cuestionadas elecciones de octubre del 19, ya no tiene que ocuparse de un viejo enemigo al que le tenía tomada la medida. Al-Shabaab, su nuevo enemigo, es más desconocido y tiene al gobierno totalmente descolocado y de momento bastante superado. La respuesta del gobierno a la creciente violencia terrorista del grupo ha ido evolucionando. De quitar inicialmente importancia a los ataques considerándolos obra de bandidos, se ha pasado a reconocer la naturaleza del problema, aunque insistiendo en verlo como una agresión externa. En la práctica se ha apostado por una respuesta eminentemente militar, reforzando el envío de tropas poco entrenadas y también mal pagadas. Y sobre todo contratando a compañías privadas de seguridad. Los mercenarios rusos del grupo Wagner habrían dejado paso a los mercenarios sudafricanos del grupo DAG. Una estrategia que no está dando resultado, puesto que los ataques se han multiplicado en los últimos meses. Además, la actuación de las fuerzas de seguridad hace tiempo que se critica por su implicación en violaciones graves de derechos humanos. La compañía francesa Total ha decidido suspender el proyecto de gas millonario que planeaba reanudar la próxima semana en el norte de Mozambique por culpa de los ataques en la zona del grupo yihadista de Al-Shabaab, que mantiene desde el miércoles un cruento asedio sobre la ciudad mozambiqueña de Palma. La reanudación del proyecto que estaba prevista para principios de semana, obviamente, ahora está suspendida, ¿eh? Mientras la situación se mantiene crítica en la zona de Palma, situada a solo unos kilómetros de Afungi. Resulta bastante curioso que toda África, un grupo de terroristas haya elegido atacar en la provincia de Cabo Delgado, al norte de Mozambique, una región que alberga enormes reservas de gas. Por el momento se habla de unos 2.500 asesinatos y más de 500.000 personas desplazadas por la violencia. Para el gobierno central, hasta ahora, la clave ha sido que los ataques no afectarán al importante puerto de Palma y a la zona de extracción de gas. Proteger el gas es más primordial que proteger a las personas. El gobierno de Mozambique metió en el pliego de condiciones a los concursos del gas que se construyera en la ciudad de Palma, una, digamos, planta de tratamiento de gas, algo que la compañía no quería para, digamos, meter trabajo e inversiones en la zona. Un gesto único y pequeño con este norte bastante desolado. Las energéticas preferían tratar el gas en sus propios barcos y evitar así tocar tierra firme. Muchos analistas creen que es ahí donde está el germen de esta hoy destructiva revuelta. El norte sabe que ellos tienen la materia prima y se quedan unas migajas, mientras el dinero baja inexorablemente al sur y se reparte entre algunas escogidas manos. La actual insurrección y las presiones internacionales y de las petroleras han hecho que el gobierno esté implementando planes de desarrollo por valor de alrededor de 35 millones de euros. Y también la creación de una agencia de desarrollo del norte que tendrá un presupuesto de cerca de 700 millones de euros. Además, el 90% proveniente de donaciones internacionales. La empresa francesa Total, que según Bloomberg tiene en la zona la mayor inversión privada de África, recordemos que ha tenido que evacuar trabajadores de su gran proyecto de extracción de gas natural licuado, valorado en más de 20.000 millones de dólares, y con esa previsión de funcionar en 2024. Por otro lado, el beneficio de la compañía francesa se aproximará este año a los 22.400 millones de euros, según las previsiones, una cifra nada desdeñable, pero que seguirá casi un 22% por debajo del beneficio declarado en 2019. Antes de que la pandemia frenase el mundo, la primera respuesta firme de las autoridades al creciente poder de los terroristas y sus cada vez más numerosos ataques fue el envío de unos mercenarios rusos de la compañía Wagner a principios de año. Hay que recordar que al principio vinieron soldados rusos, pero huyeron enseguida porque no podían contener los ataques de los yihadistas. Algunas fuentes consultadas hablan de una huida vergonzosa de los soldados a sueldo y otras de que los rusos estaban perdidos en una complicada geografía en la zona y optaron por retirarse. Tras el fracasado plan ruso, ha tocado el turno a los mercenarios sudafricanos. Ellos están más adaptados a este tipo de terreno. Parece que actúan bajo la compañía de seguridad Dick Advisory Group, guiada por el excoronel Dick, un viejo conocido del país por haber participado en las batallas de los años 80 y 90 entre Renamo y Frelimo. Y la última de las preguntas que se llevaron a cabo en la entrevista, si el profesor Vreÿ creía que debería ser la postura de Estados Unidos en el sur de África con respecto a la que estaba sucediendo en Cabo Delgado. ¿Cuál era la implicación y la postura internacional de la diplomacia norteamericana en el caso de Mozambique y en concreto en Cabo Delgado ante la insurgencia yihadista en la zona? Como África se ha convertido para Rusia y China en el nuevo territorio, de disputa para su influencia comercial y política, a medida que Occidente ha empezado a reducir su presencia en África, ese vacío ha quedado a disposición de las estrategias de Pekín y de Moscú, que puedan tener en el continente sus propios intereses. China es, relativamente hablando, un recién llegado a África, pero ha desarrollado un agresivo proyecto de alta inversión y comercio que lo ha visto establecerse firmemente en varios países, particularmente subsaharianos, con grandes proyectos de infraestructura y cooperación económica. Rusia, por su parte, ya no goza de los mismos fuertes vínculos que tenía en épocas de la Unión Soviética con sus aliados africanos, antioccidentales, durante la Guerra Fría. Sin embargo, sus últimas iniciativas apuntan a la reactivación de esa histórica relación e incluso la incursión en nuevos territorios. Esas metas rusas quedaron en evidencia con la gira del pasado marzo del año 2021 del ministro de Relaciones Exteriores ruso Sergei Lavrov por Namibia, Zimbabue, Angola, Mozambique y Etiopía, países del antiguo eje de influencia de la URSS. Además, el reciente asesinato en circunstancias misteriosas de 3 periodistas rusos que investigaban la presencia militar de Rusia en la República Centroafricana reavivó especulaciones sobre los nuevos intereses del Kremlin y sus posibles operaciones clandestinas en ese país. A pesar de tener una numerosa población afroamericana descendiente de los esclavos llegados desde el siglo XVII, Estados Unidos no ha cultivado muchas relaciones con África y cuenta con muy pocos aliados en el continente. Washington ha mirado hacia África principalmente ante amenazas a su propia seguridad y por el miedo a la creciente influencia de potencias rivales, pero no mantiene una estrategia integral ni ha conseguido lograr relaciones duraderas con los países africanos. La ola de independencias africanas comenzó a mediados de los años 50, al contrario que con Etiopía. Esta vez Estados Unidos no tomó partido y no se pronunció a favor de la descolonización, pero tampoco ni se opuso ni apoyó a las potencias europeas para impedirla. Sin embargo, la descolonización trabajó, digamos, al poder de una serie de líderes que buscaron asociarse con la Unión Soviética, que sí había apoyado su causa. En cualquier caso, todos los recién independizados países africanos se unieron al movimiento de países no alineados, pues no querían posicionarse en una guerra entre superpotencias, pero no pudieron tampoco impedir que la Guerra Fría llegara al continente. Durante la Guerra Fría, pocos países africanos fueron aliados expresos de Estados Unidos. Uno de ellos fue Kenia, que todavía sigue siendo su principal aliado en el África subsahariana. El entonces presidente keniano, Daniel Arap Moi, permitió la construcción de una base naval norteamericana en Mombasa. Otro caso particular es el cambio de cromos entre Etiopía y Somalia, dos vecinos enfrentados. Cuando triunfó el golpe comunista del año 74, en Etiopía y la Unión Soviética pasó a ayudar al tradicional aliado norteamericano, el dictador somalí Siad Barre, hasta entonces apoyado por la URSS, se pasó al bando occidental. Estados Unidos apoyó la invasión que Barre lanzó contra Etiopía. A cambio, Barre accedió a la instalación de una base militar en el puerto somalí de Berbera, lugar estratégico en pleno Golfo de Adén, donde se controla la entrada al Mar Rojo desde el Océano Índico en el estrecho de Bab al-Mandeb, con el fin de, en la Guerra Fría, pues evidentemente llegó a un nuevo mundo en el que Estados Unidos era la única potencia global. Y esa potencia perdió buena parte de su interés por África. Estados Unidos sí se involucró, evidentemente, en esa promoción de la democracia en el continente a través de organismos internacionales, ligado principalmente a la ayuda al desarrollo, a la promoción democrática. Hasta 33 países introdujeron límites a los mandatos presidenciales. El primer ejemplo llegó con la intervención en Somalia en el año 93. 2 años antes, el régimen de Barre se había desmoronado y el país cayó en un vacío de poder con una amalgama de grupos rebeldes peleando por el control de la capital, Mogadiscio. Empujado por la presión mediática norteamericana, el presidente George Bush envió 30.000 soldados a Somalia en una misión calificada de humanitaria, aunque Estados Unidos bien sabemos que intervendría también para asegurarse un gobierno afín en un país de gran interés estratégico y antiguo aliado de los Estados Unidos. Este revés traumático alejó al vencedor de la Guerra Fría de África y le llevó a evitar otros conflictos. El gobierno norteamericano no intervino para detener el genocidio en Ruanda en el 94 y tampoco tomó parte en la Guerra Civil de Liberia en el 89 al 96. O la Guerra Civil en la República Democrática del Congo, que estalló con la caída de Mobutu en el año 1997. La postura norteamericana para África cambió en el 98. Este año, 2 atentados simultáneos contra las embajadas de Estados Unidos en Kenia y Tanzania dejaron 224 víctimas mortales, 12 de ellas norteamericanas. El ataque sacó a la luz pública el nombre de Al-Qaeda y el de su líder Osama Bin Laden y supuso el comienzo de la política antiterrorista norteamericana en la región, que aumentó tras el ataque a las Torres Gemelas de Nueva York en 2001. Desde entonces, el objetivo principal de Washington en África ha sido contener el yihadismo, especialmente en el norte de África y el Sahel, contra Boko Haram, Al-Qaeda en el Magreb Islámico y otros grupos, y en el Cuerno de África contra Al-Shabaab, la filial de Al-Qaeda en Somalia. Evidentemente, en 2007, Estados Unidos estableció un comando en África, el AFRICOM, para centralizar las tareas militares en el continente. Además, han puesto en marcha misiones de formación y apoyo en el Sahel y en Somalia, y cuentan con una base militar en Djibouti y la ayuda de Kenia, que evidentemente se ha convertido en su principal aliado africano. Y en la guerra contra el terror y en la guerra contra el terrorismo, Kenia, digamos, es un país muy importante en esa alianza africana con Estados Unidos. Y por otra parte, Estados Unidos mantiene en el continente 7.000 soldados y ha participado en más de 3.500 misiones. Y con ello pues pondríamos punto y final a ese análisis, a esa contextualización de la entrevista que hemos realizado en INISEG CAST al profesor Francois. Muchas gracias por su atención. Buenas tardes.